Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Analysis with Ro. I am your host, Ro, giving you the latest of all things that are on my mind in relation to fiction. Today, we come back with another analyzation episode. Today, we're going to be analyzing something particularly exciting, at least on my end. We're going to be talking more so about the gender exploration of Illumi Zoldyck. I think this is certainly exciting considering the nature of this character and how many interpretations you can make and how each one is very interesting. With me, we are going to be using the interpretation of somebody who is a female at birth that has more so of a journey within transmasculinity. So, as we explore it using that perspective, I do want to give a disclaimer that, of course, everybody's perspective is different. I believe there's a couple that I've read where it's kind of the opposite end, where it's more so trans-femininity rather than trans-masculinity. In my sense, it's trans-masculinity with a sense of gender fluidity / androgyny at the same time. So even though it's within the sphere of trans-masculinity, there's a freedom within the gender presentation to the point where it's like, there's kind of a, I don't know how many times I could say fluidity, but there's a feeling of not really caring clothing wise or like certain other presentations, but of course with things maybe more so along the lines of like pronouns and things like that, it would stay within more so of the masculine end of things. So that is normally how we are going to explore this character's gender. All right, let us get started. So one of the most hardest obstacles that somebody can deal with in life is essentially dealing with one's own physical appearance and the expectations that go along with it. This bag of skin and bones come with a lot of societal expectations. Can you believe? I do wish we could live in a world in which that's not necessarily the case, and people, as long as they're not doing anything inherently dangerous, can do whatever the hell they want, right? But, you know, we don't live in that kind of world. So even if being born into a feminine body isn't always terrible, mind you, it does have its benefits. There's a lot of things that society can give you that does give the notion or the connotation that they like treating people within more so of a feminine build. So, like, people who are typically feminine / a female at birth / socialized as female, they tend to treat us, in particular, a little cruelly. Yeah, a little not nice vibes. So, although there are certain similarities between that Hunter's world and ours, one of the main contrasts is the elusive freedom that specifically trans people experience there. So let's elaborate on that a little bit, because I do feel like certain people are going to be like, what about this situation? Let me explain. I believe first and foremost the situation that you're going to pertain to is specifically with Alika. Alika is kind of a weird situation, but it's not necessarily because he's trans. It's more so because she is the scapegoat of her family, and with this family taking just everything to the extreme and essentially being like, her powers are like out of place compared to ours, right? So we kind of discussed that before within the dysfunctional family episode. So like, her powers are out of place, she was out of place. They wanted her to feel like as much of an outsider as possible. They wanted to make her feel like she doesn't belong. I do believe that she probably had like powers that's stereotypically aligned more so with the family, something that's more so controllable, right? Not seen as something that was wild. Because again, we're talking about an enmeshed narcissistic household that's kind of cult-like in a way, but mostly narcissistic and enmeshed. We're going to keep it there. But yeah, cult-like too in a sense. And they like everything to be highly controlled. They like things to be very much so predictable. And if you're unpredictable, they are going to treat that unpredictability with the worst things they'll demand due to fear. Again, not an excuse, just a reason as to why that is the case, right? Due to fear, there's just all kinds of things that could have happened. So I don't think it's necessarily her gender that was inherently the problem. They would not have they clearly don't care with like the other kids as far as like their gender presentation goes. They don't really care that much. It's not really something that they focus on. There is a sense of like freedom with at least gender presentation and other things go. I feel like, and I said this before in another mini podcast on Twitter specifically, more so of the lines of when it comes to like full on like switches, like pronouns and stuff like that, they do probably live within a system that has to have you earn it. So there's that. But other than that, there's kind of more so again of that freedom that the Hunter x Hunter world probably has overall. In this case, they seem to not like care as much. Versus like in our world, there is more so of a sense of rigidity. It does depend on where you are, but for the most part, there is a sense of more so rigidity, and it is more so strict and puritanical in a lot of ways. So there are certain limits that our world has that maybe their worlds, in the context of like both gender and sexuality, that they do not have. Like there's certain restrictions that we have that they are more so like open to, and they don't really have as much of. However, with that being said, that does not mean things like misogyny, patriarchy, racism, and other systemic issues don't exist. Clear to see that, for example, it's clear to see with like with Media City, there's a sense of like classism. There is a sense of probably racial hierarchies as well. It's just something that I have not dived deep into yet, but more so along the lines of classism. There was things like human trafficking and like just general things like slave labor, just all kinds of things that does happen within our world due to hierarchies that still does exist in their world. It's just that one of the things that they don't really seem to care as much about, or they care about it in a different way. So I guess the best way to describe it is, let's say that in the world of Hunter x Hunter, you are like a queer woman. They will not care as much if you are queer. They care that you're a woman. See? Yeah, the woman part is what they care about. The queer part is left out of the question. Or it will probably not be as much of a factor. It could be a factor depending on who you're interacting with, but not to the point where it's as troubling in our world. Glad we had that established. So, again, parallels between misogyny and other systemic issues in both our world and theirs. We have that established. So, in what ways does Illumi specifically deal with these gender norms and express their gender in a way that seems natural to them? Let us look into the section of gender exploration, dive deeper, get into it. This is going to be overall a very, very fun thing that we're going to be discussing right about now. So, the first thing that we have to establish is, of course, navigating the crime market. So, they are assassins, of course. So that means the black market, dark market, there's multiple names for it. That is their working space, their workspace, if you will. So, labor. Let's talk about labor. You know, a job, capitalism. Don't love it. Not a fan. Personally. But it does have its benefits. Hate the system, love money though. That's my complication. Personally. I'm speaking a little anecdotally. It's like, love money, hate the system. What can I say? Like, I'm not a worshiper of money, don't get me wrong. Don't. I'm not like that. But it's like, it's a journey, you know? Again, labor has its benefits, it has its drawbacks. But what if your work is one of a kind? And I know what you're thinking. It depends on, like, your thing like that. You know, if you work for, like, a fast food joint, you're probably not thinking, my work is one of a kind. right? But if you more so have like a career, say you are like a veterinarian or you're a biologist or something like that, even though it's still kind of a common job, there's obviously like more qualifications to it, and there's a lot of uniqueness to the job. There's certain qualifications that you have that, of course, no offense, somebody who worked at maybe like retail essentially probably cannot relate to. So when you have like a work kind of like that, where it's kind of one of a kind, where it's something that you've learned over time, right? This is something that you build skills upon. That's not to say like any job is unskilled. All jobs are skilled, but there's just different types of skills. For me, I like to classify it as more so common skills. So again, more so like retail, fast food industry, things like that. Common skills, right? These are things in general that you could pick up probably like fairly quickly. Of course, it's not an everybody thing. I know for like Pacific people, myself included, especially when it comes to neurodivergent people, though that isn't to say that they have not worked in these industries. I just know that it tends to be a little bit harder. But fairly enough, on the opposite end, where you have like uncommon, skills in which you learn, this is really where my fellow neurodivergent people, they tend to really shine, right? Because these are more so Pacific interest, right? Things that you invest into as far as like academia and things like that go. So kind of just filtering it down to something that you could really be passionate and Pacific about, while at the same time making money. So with that being said, being an assassin, right, when we're talking about that kind of Pacific labor, it requires a cool amount of calculation and subtlety, right? So when we're talking assassination, we're talking a job that of course has a Pacific skill set, one of which is obviously murder, but there's plenty of others too, which we'll dive into in a minute. But one of the things that I want to get into in the sense of gender exploration is just understanding that this, along with many other crime markets, so crime industries, essentially they are overwhelmingly male dominated and unquestionably one of the riskiest professions. Now, of course, within our world in Pacific and theirs in a sense, but again, there's more of that grayness in their world than in ours, not as much. I'll say this to say, of course, having like high percentages for your Pacific gender when it comes to crime, inherently a bad thing, right? I'm not saying like, oh, it's so terrible, women should be out here committing more crimes, or anybody that's a gender minority should be committing crimes. Please. Oh God, no, please. Don't take that as like advice where it's like, you know what? This inspired me. I'm gonna increase the statistics. Women deserve, and other gender minorities too, deserve representation within the crime market. Oh God, in our world, please do not do that. Like, I know, particularly like in our world, there are cases of people romanticizing the life of crime, but let's get one thing straight. Probably not a thing to necessarily romanticize, right? We want to establish that difference. So back to the point of basically anybody that's either a woman or someone that has like a feminine appearance / gender minorities in general, they are unfortunately greatly devalued in any market, by the way. We're talking just in any industry at all. Greatly devalued in the workplace. I believe like the gender wage gap is still very much so a thing. The fact that, the so-called pink collar jobs, right? So you have like teachers, nurses, things like that. Their pay is very low specifically because, and I don't know how recently I've learned this. I think I've learned this back when I was like in high school. But there's a reason why, teachers get paid so low, and that's because it is specifically a feminine oriented jobs. So like pink collar jobs, which are jobs that are more so quote unquote feminine oriented. I don't like saying that's the case because I feel like it shouldn't matter what gender the person's working, as long as they're doing a good job. They should be paired fairly. Again, if only we lived in that kind of world, right? That's not necessarily the case though. So because there's a high amount of women within those industries, the pay for those specific industries are low. Another thing along with the lines of that is also probably like hospice. So basically elderly homes and things like that. From what I heard, there's not that much of a high amount of pay versus like the other, healthcare professionals. So it's just a lot of bullshit due to sexism, to be honest and to be for real. So like in general, obviously not just within the crime market, but there's generally just kind of a devaluation of all things associated with the feminine, including the work. It's ridiculous. So psychologists believe that there is a perceived lack of person job fit is the cause of overall gender bias against women. And of course, when I refer women, not just women, but like gender minorities in general, but in organizational decisions about managers and higher level personnel, i.e., an expectation that women are just ill-equipped to handle male gender typed jobs. So again, sex is bullshit, just off the bat. So here, the woman's stereotype of being soft and delicate, and that women belong to home, cult of domesticity, blah, 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 blah. You get the gist. It does a significant amount of harm to how one is perceived at work in general. So, specifically when referring back to the Zoldyck household being inherently patriarchal, and of course following all these other things that we have discussed, how does this blend into the Zoldyck house? Well, of course, probably a good example other than looking at the oldest kid is like take a look at how they view Kikyo, like the mom character. After she essentially, so what I assume is like she got brought into the home. She kind of had to like prove herself to essentially be strong enough to withstand this Zoldyck household. Maybe for a certain amount of time she was allowed to work and all these other things, but similar to a lot of other standards, I would say that are arguably similar to, I don't know what the Russian equivalent to the Victorian era would be, but I believe with them, they had like the Russian Revolution. So there is a sense of Russian aristocracy, maybe. So I think that's their equivalent. So with that being said, kind of having those similar models still kind of being in place within the Zoldyck house, right? Along mixing that with like how specifically Chinese society. So first and foremost, I think, before Kikyo came in, there was a blend of originally a mixture of Chinese along with Russian kind of ideals, because they do live in kind of the equivalent of, imagine if like Africa was up in the north instead of the south kind of thing. So instead of it being really hot, it would either be typically probably how like North America's weather is, depending on where you are. If you're like in the middle, then you're probably gonna feel like more so mild kind of things, or like maybe all 4 seasons, maybe 2, maybe 1, depending on what your state is at. But instead of states, it's still countries. So just kind of imagine a similar thing there. I don't know. Fun fact, maybe not fun fact, but like fun thing. I think what country within Africa has like all 4 seasons? It might be South Africa, ironically enough. I will have to see and do the research for that, but overall, also like Algeria, which is basically our equivalent to where they're at, they do have mountains, like legit, like cold mountains too. did not know that. You learn something new every day. Again, doing the research for this thing, you bump into new facts every day. So you live in that kind of equivalent, but I will say this kind of as a general consensus, they were living in an isolated version of that. So like, even though the outside society might look completely different, we probably, from what I can tell, I don't believe we have like a good indication. I have my guesses of what, you know, the outside society looks like outside of the Zoldyck home, where they are from. But they don't seem to interact much with that. So basically, their ideals are completely, I would argue, different from just everybody else outside. And of course, that makes more sense considering the concept of isolation, especially, and kind of instilling in your children this different worldview. Again, that unhealthy worldview that we talked about within the attachment style podcast, right? That have later developed, for at least the first kid, a sense of like fearful avoidance. So there's that. There's definitely an element of seeing that, even in the sense of culture and how compared to maybe like everybody else, you know, within society, there's not as much like integration, right? There's kind of this difference where it's like, oh, this is our household and this is how we generally do things, but we are just so isolated from everybody else. A good example of this, like in the real world, again, I'm going to be using fundamentalist families a lot. I believe there's plenty of fundamentalist families you could choose from. Let's go with the Duggars, probably. Right? So, like, anybody who has watched documentaries on end about the Duggars, of course, we know how dark that family is and, you know, their tendencies. But along with that, they lived, before most of the kids escaped, they lived a pretty isolated lifestyle, right? Like, their ideals compared to everybody else is just so vastly different, right? So when they finally found a way to integrate back into the world, if you will, right, kind of integrate back into general society, there was just a lot of things that they had to either relearn or just completely start anew, because again, never really been taught that before. You kind of been taught about this one thing, this one way, and then eventually when you have like outside influences of any kind, I believe like one of the Duggar girls, her outside influence, ironically enough, we talked about this too, with this character, it's like also her fiance / now husband. Funny how that works, right? But yeah, that was just another thing where it's like, wow, I did not know about this kind of life and all this other stuff. And there was certain, you know, standards and ideals that I had to follow that going back into general society, that's not necessarily an expectation at all. So, why am I talking about it in this way? So, how would it be for someone who lives in society's shadows? Let's talk about that right now, right? So, perception at work, inherently misogynistic, right? So after like proving herself and all this other stuff with Kikyo, going back on topic, after she would have like the first baby, right, things start slowing down, right? And a similarity to that would be like work in the case of especially like the US, right? After you would have kids, maternal leave here especially is jack shit. It's so poor. It's horrendous. There is a high chance of, we know we say this like back in the day, like, what was it? The Victorian / Industrial Revolution, like women were at risk of getting fired if they were pregnant. I believe like the US hasn't really changed much from that. Like there's still a high risk for that. So just imagine that for this particular character that we are using as an example, right? So like with Kikyo, you have like the first kid, it starts slowing things down, right? There starts being like quote unquote gaps within the resume. Be like, oh, you just weren't working as much, you know? And it's like, but we're professionals, and it's like, we can't really have that, you know? They view essentially anybody with a feminine body as a necessity, so still like a tool. It's gross. It is gross. A necessity, but kind of dispensable is probably a good word to use. Like, you have a purpose, you're there, but you're also kind of blocking the way. Like, move, scooch, and let the real people go through. It's a really gross way of viewing people, but again, when you live within a heavily patriarchal household, that is generally the mentality. Where it's like, there's a certain role for you, there's a certain way in which you fit. I would argue that even in the case of, like, again, kind of a more fluid mindset when it comes into taste of gender and sexuality, that has more freedom, but everything else, with the way that I'm describing, you would say that it's fairly conservative. Everything else is fairly conservative. So it'd be like, yes, you can present yourself in that way, but especially if you have like a certain body type, it's like, it still has to be covered in a sense. There better not be like that much skin showing, God forbid. Or, oh, God forbid you do this or that, you know, like there's still control. Like, it's still a conservative mentality, it's just altered slightly. It's weird. It's really weird. So again, slow down, and then finally when the hire gets born, stop working. Just, your job is essentially to take care of the kids. And for whatever reason, actually we do know the reason. We'll get into that, especially when analyzing both Kikyo and Silva. Multitudes of reasons where it's like, this woman is clearly unfit. We told you that she wouldn't fit in. She broke under the pressure eventually. We don't know what to do. You already like kind of scared away whoever originally was supposed to be arranged to you. Fuck are we gonna do? And it'd be like, well, I mean, the first kid is here. The first kid has essentially the thing that we need, again, being someone who was already, in a sense, already socialized as more so on the feminine end anyways. Someone who is more so on the ends of someone being a female at birth inherently. Even though we have a general acceptance of their general identity, certain roles still have to be fulfilled regardless. And because for whatever reason, quote unquote, we know the reason. Like, I'm saying whatever reason in quotations. Like, we know the reason, but it's like, I just don't get it. We need someone to essentially take care of the hire, and I just don't think that woman is fit or mentally stable enough. So it'd be like, okay, well, the first kid is basically my wife 2.0 without any of the troublesome things. So maybe like outside influences, like they've been in here, like in the house, like this is all that they know, right? So here comes that sense of parentification that we're going to talk about later, especially a common one that I see again with fundamentalist families, especially, right? Even like with parentification being a personal trauma for me, mine different from like a fundamentalist family's. There's different types of parentification, I would fairly say. Theirs is different from mine. We'll get into that when we get to that episode, but for right now, just in general, right? It's like, well, we already got someone well prepared for that. You know, might as well permanently place them in the role of a caretaker anyways. And the dysfunctional role of the caretaker was then born. Where it's like, this is your purpose. Take care of the babies. I know you didn't birth them or whatever, but it's like, somebody's gotta take care of them. You seem more so fit to follow my rules, right? Because like, pretend I'm Silva. It's like, you seem more so fit to follow like my rules and things like that versus like your mom. She's always arguing, I don't got time for this. I need to raise like the perfect hire and bullshit like that. So you are a quote unquote more perfect version of your mom. And you see, like, even the way I'm talking, right? You're gonna get that feeling within parentification / adultification within, like, childhood, where it's like, da-da-da-da-da, your mom doesn't know what she's doing. It's like, you seem like more so of the perfect fit, and it's like, talking about all these adult topics. Not like, hopefully, not like too adult. When people think adult, they mean, like, sexual. It's like, that's not what I'm referring to. At least I hope the fuck not. Then again, you never know. But, like, it's safe to say probably not, right? But, like, other adult topics, right? Mature things that you probably should still not be talking to your kids about. Not necessarily anything, like, inherently sexual, but, like, things where it's like, you sure this is something that you should talk to your kids about? This seems like something that you should rant and rave to your partner about, but, like, you're not going to. We know the reason, or at least we'll dive into that a little bit later, if you don't know. But it's just, a lot. You know what I mean? So let's get into the statistics. Speaking of women stereotypes and all that, but it's like, yeah, it's like disregarded, pushed to the side. So, according to the stats, men tend to commit more crimes. So, 79% of all offenders are generally male. You got 17% that are generally female, and then the remaining 3% of other gender minorities. So, when it comes to the crime system of assassinations in Pacific, one must ask, what does it take to be an assassin? So in this next section, we are going to dive more so into the Pacific portions of what it takes to be an assassin. So kind of like the elements of the general work. And then we're going to dive deeper into that with a more gender perspective in mind. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to dive right back into this. I will see y'all soon. Hello everybody, welcome back. I know we just took a very short break, and now we're back and we're going to dive right back into it. So sexism within the crime market, let's go everybody. Let's talk about it. So, women and other gender minorities, they are frequently disregarded in the criminal world due to the gender salary imbalance. What? The gender pay gap is still following you even within the crime market? Girl, apparently. With women earning like 7% less than men. That's some bullshit. Okay? Conversations between men or women are severely divided in certain, like, criminal societies, since chatting with women is frowned upon and feminine for criminal men. So, like, in other words, I talked about this so much, specifically with, like, Silver, where it's like, there's just certain things where it's like, you can't do it. I'm too much of a man. It's not my job. You can do it. Right? Again, we're going to talk about this more so in the sense of, like, child rearing for killers. It's like, you can handle the baby. You'd be like, me? It's like, you got it. You're amazing. You'd be like, aren't you the parent too? You'd be like, no, I'm not even here. That's what's crazy. You're doing such a good job. Fucking weaponizing competence. Jesus Christ, it's Simia. Anyways, women are rarely allowed to discuss within discussion groups, and they're rarely allowed in positions of leadership. So I feel like one of the main things and topics that are discussed is like, why wasn't the person considered a hire? To me, I feel like this is probably the main reason. It's like, you look, and it'd be like, no! And it's like, what the fuck? Oh, that's so stupid. Even like back when, like, learning about history, it's like, for a lot of us, didn't you just find that rule, like, overall just kind of stupid? It's like, patriarchy. What are you gonna do? Hopefully a lot, especially nowadays. It's like, things are changing, but it's like, fucking hell, man. It's like, yeah, it's like, fuck you. anyways, the women who were or are in positions of leadership, or any other gender minority at that matter, are viewed as more trustworthy, since they have more of the quote-unquote, and I do mean unquote, masculine qualities. Again, researchers' words, not specifically mine. So, with a position of leadership, these women tend to facilitate their family business by managing finances and other business transactions. Now, I believe that specifically for Illumi, his character does that partially, but never to as much as like the men of the house. So it's like, you're a part of the room. You are within the room where it happens. Yes, that was a Hamilton reference. We're gonna have a lot of those. But it's like, yes, you were within the room where it happens, but even within the room where it happens, there wasn't like that much that you could do. So, is it really being worth within the room where it happens? Let me stop. Let me shut the fuck up now. Alright, moving on. So, the main reason that, these women and other gender minorities, of course, tend to get ignored is very much so due to the strict gender roles within the criminal industry. And again, I kind of hinted about that a lot. I hinted it a lot more in my deleted Twitter account, but because it's deleted, I can't get any of the shit back, so we're just going to talk about it again here. So, we hint a lot about that, specifically when discussing characters like Silva and Zeno, and just all the male elders within the house, like men within the house, you know what I mean? And just kind of being like, the women got it. That's like the ladies, they got it. We're just gonna handle everything business. It's like the children and all that. The domestic sphere, that's y'all's thing. You can do that. Yeah, it's like, again, referencing back to what I said before, it's like, yeah, gender and sexuality, it's like there might be more like freedom as far as that kind of goes. But there's a lot of things that are still very much so conservative. This is probably one of those things, where it's like, Cecilia, this is where you are. This is what you do. There's no changing it. So, that being said, women who are partnered with men are frequently viewed as accessories to men. We see this a lot for this character, right? Where it's like, I am willing to, willing to sacrifice myself. I don't really, consider myself, kind of like the sense of, codependency. We talked about that before, right? Where it's like, I'm going to disregard the self completely. I am essentially a tool, right? An accessory, a tool. I'm objectifying the self. I'm no longer, someone who has a sense of, self-autonomy, right? It's like, that's the weird thing about this character, because on one hand, you don't want to be at the point of, infantilization. That's not what you want. But at the same time, you do understand that the autonomy is altered. Whether you like discussing that for this character or not, everybody's comfortability around that topic is understandably different, but it's it's still true. The autonomy is, como se dice, altered, to put it simply. So, women who, again, we talked about it, accessories, they are frequently objectified, we talked about that, and sexualized. Now, this is interesting, and I think for the tea talks, we'll dive a bit more into the third part. But for now, those are the main things that you need to know. So as well as having primarily supportive roles in these organizations, we talk about this a lot, specifically with Illumi's character, right? The dysfunctional role of essentially kind of being a caretaker within the household. That counts as a supportive role, right? Where it's even if I go out and do all these missions and all this other stuff, there still will be a baby on my back. So it's that is still the expectation. It's yes, do all these missions and all this other stuff, but it's especially back when it's the babies were babies. It's they do all these other missions and all this other stuff, but make sure that the maids and the servants and all this other stuff, because again, with wealthier people, the roles are slightly different. They essentially are more so managerial. So instead of inherently doing like everything, even though it probably depends, but it's like everything, it would more so just be like order, this specific person to do that and this specific person to do that. So it's like you gotta arrange the schedule. So again, household managing still there. It just looks different depending on your class, but it's still there. So that nuance is there. So yeah. Men, therefore, are trusted with the more so like violent physical labor within their industries. And again, we see this a lot within the Zoldyck household, and they're a liking to powers such as being like a transmuter and an enhancer, because those two powers are the ones that have the most like physicalities. They are the more so like physical, laborious, if that's the word, type of powers where it's like hands-on kind of thing, right? Where it's like, the manly is the best kind of thing. It really is the case here, where it's like physical strength is really of high importance, even though in my opinion it should probably be more like manipulators and specialists. But hey, in the world of patriarchy, let's be real, sometimes shit doesn't make sense because of male ego. Different discussion, different day. We will actually get into that later. For now, let's talk about another positive, right? So with all that being said, women are trusted with caregiving roles. It's not that bad, because here's a good part, right? Caregiving roles therefore make it easier to manipulate and control others. I said good part, kind of, sort of. Let me clarify. Good in the sense of maybe like the type of work we're doing. Not good generally. Sissy. Let's clarify. It's like not good generally. It's like, definitely wouldn't recommend this for everyday life. But, for this specific industry, great skills to have. So it kind of just be like keeping people off guard, where it's like, you look this way. You're not going to do anything. You look soft, delicate. You look like, and again, this is described by like literally a character within Hunter x Hunter. It's like described Illumi as like a doll. So it'd be like, when you think of a doll, first of all, recently, like what movie came out? The Barbie movie, right? When you think of a Barbie doll, you're not thinking of a doll that looks like a G.I. Joe, right? You're not thinking muscular. You're not thinking, oh yeah, tough sweat and muscles and guns and whatever else. That's not what you're thinking. You are generally thinking more so of the lines of pretty, delicate, small, those things. But it's like that kind of image, being there. To be like, yeah, the image is there. Stab! You didn't expect that stab. What you gonna do now? You weren't expecting that. Right? What's a good movie example? Gone Girl. That's a perfect movie example of, kind of using the feminine expectations that society has as a weapon, right? Kind of altering that a little bit and being like, oh, I had to like pretend to be a dying pregnant mother so that people can feel like sympathetic towards me. In all actuality, I'm basically out here committing a crime, but nobody else knows that because they're too busy feeling bad for me. So like, hey, you can use it to your advantage. By the way, don't actually take this advice in real life. If you end up going to jail or something, I warned you not to actually do this. Please. Oh my God. Could you imagine? Imagine. But seriously, And people in that role are less likely to be suspected of a crime. Of course, I use the example of Gone Girl, but there are plenty of others that you could probably think of in your head right now as well. So, however, women are unfortunately used as pawns for their families within this industry. So with that being said, there is that negative thing. They typically are sold to repay family debts. Women are more likely to be sexual violence victims, resulting in a victim offender overlap. We're going to talk more about this right now, actually. Right? So specifically, if you are within my Twitter audience, then you have saw the discussion of debutante balls and things like that, right? Let me extend it a step further. Of course, with these debutante balls, of course, being within the lines of more so of the criminal market, there are certain things that, you know, because you're dealing with darker, salacious men, put it simply, right? There's certain things that in a typical debutante ball might not slide, but within this debutante ball, even though it's like still high society and proper, it's darker. So it's like, some fucked up shit going on. I ain't gonna lie to you. There's that. And there's the victim offender overlap, which is actually specifically for the research that I was doing. This is not necessarily the case for this character, but for others where it's like they end up grabbing victims to then again be placed into the criminal system to be essentially used once more. It's really gross. But that's more so the lines of, I think, if I'm ever going to do research on specifically the mafia for this world, that's probably what more so maybe the mafia women within are doing, kind of thing. Really gross shit. Again, not rocking with the mafia both in this world and the real world. Not rocking with it. Not a fan. Different discussion, but that's just an additional fact, you know, just kind of to think about. But there is kind of a victim offender overlap, not necessarily in this case with sexual violence, but of course we see that with more so of the physical / emotional violence. So there's that. So like that victim offender overlap is there, but not in the context of like sexual violence, luckily. So these gendered responsibilities are backed by familiar roles, and the family structure keeps the business running smoothly. So again, everybody has their specific roles. We talked about this within the dysfunctional family episode. It's like everyone has a specific role. Everybody has the thing that they're supposed to do, and nobody has to fall out of line. Even though I would argue, especially nowadays, most of the kids within this family definitely falling out of line. We'll talk about that towards the end, but women and any other gender minority are commonly prompted by duties. That is the reason they do what they do. So it'd be like, what's another good example? I think with The Sopranos, there is Carmilla, right? Where it's like, you know, I'm out here and my husband's like doing all these things, but it's okay because it's for the family. It's that mentality. It's exactly that mentality. Where it's like, I know all these things are wrong and I still have like a conscience and whatnot, but it's like, my family still has to be in this place of like, you know, financial structure and stability, even though I would argue this line of work is probably not the most financially stable. After all, it's like, it's very more susceptible to fall apart, but hey, that's a different conversation that we'll have entirely when we talk about family systems and this older family as a system. So there's that. It's very shaky, as you can clearly see, especially now, very unstable. It's like the foundation is crumbling. It's been crumbling for a while. Now it's crackling. It's been doing that for a little while. So that's the reason they do what they do. Motivations are usually for the benefit of their families rather than for personal gain. Versus, I would argue, probably more so with the men, it would be more so for personal gain, right? Where it's like, yes, I'm gonna be so rich, make so much money. It'd be like, what about everybody else? It'd be like, yeah, that too, yeah. But what about me though? And it'd be like, oh my god, just a lot of selfishness, So with that in mind, we may see some of those reasons, and we do actually see some of those reasons within Illumi for like, oh, I gotta do it for the family, that kind of mentality. I feel like that's probably the most obvious part about this character. Most people have observed that. So specifically revealed in like both the Hunter and Election storyline, that we see that mainly he revealed that he was responsible for Killua's child rearing, and with their father serving as like the major patriarchal role, again being like the controller of the family, like everybody else has a specific role placed. Discuss that within the dysfunctional family episodes. Like everybody has a specific thing going on, and it's like you're supposed to just stay in that box. Don't you dare move out. If you move out of that box, you're in some deep trouble. Right, so another example is the needle in Killua's head that, may I remind you, was ordered by Silva to be placed in the head. So just letting that nuance in there. You're open to discuss all about that within the comic section. That is something I'm actually opening the table for, which was implanted with precise instructions to protect Killua from harm, and thus indirectly fulfills the duty of caregiving as well. Mind you, not in the most sane of ways. I'm not condoning that specific thing. Specifically with like, here's the thing, and I didn't discuss this yet, right? But we're gonna discuss it a little bit now, right? With mind control powers, I believe like, what was it? Generation V, essentially like the boys, I believe. Like the new one, there is a misname going on. I will not say the character's name, but all you need to know is this, right? So there's this girl character. She has mind control powers. I believe, like, what's another good show? The Umbrella Academy has, you know, obviously a character who has mind control powers. And one of the things that are explored is the concept of kind of like mind control powers and consent. Especially when it's like you're kind of digging into somebody else's head. And kind of that gray morality around the consent of that, right? Kind of just like you're digging into somebody else, you're thinking somebody else's thoughts. And over time we see these with those characters. Their psyche in a way kind of breaks. It's definitely one of those powers where it's like there's a vast, huge amount of responsibility. I'm talking so huge because, you know, you're already on shaky grounds. You're fucking with somebody else's head. There's already kind of a sense of very dark gray morality around that. I'm not gonna go as far as to say completely black, but like definitely dark gray. You're already treading on some light waters due to your powers, right? So with that being said, I definitely think like the needle in Killua's head, I'm not gonna argue that that's right at all, because it's not. I think, again, specifically not just with like mind control, but again the concepts of like consent and all that things, yeah, probably not the best idea to be out here messing with somebody's head like that. So even though it was ordered by Silva, so you could also probably say it was like, you know, like their dad did that. It was like took advantage of essentially that power and be like, oh yes, I could use this for my benefit. It'd be like, yeah, that is necessarily the case. So again, there's a certain nuance with that conversation. I want to see what y'all talk about in the comment section around that specifically, because I know there's been some debate about it and I would love to see it. So that being said, Illumi also participates in violent roles as well that may be perceived as quote-unquote masculine, I put it in quotations, and thus at times blurs the lines of work, which are rare and only a small percentage of a female birth individuals get to do within the crime industry. I'll say this as to say, how Illumi does it is still kind of like more subtle, which again, I would argue is probably the better way of doing it, but for whatever reason, they obviously like the physical labor part more, even though with assassination, maybe it's best to just not do that. Like, I think would a manipulator and specialist would probably be more fit for the job, but it's like, again, sometimes patriarchy does not make sense, and that is mainly due to the male ego. Oh! Sisimia! Moving on. The worst thing is how people tend to underestimate, right? Anyone with a femme body. So, because whereas some women and other gender minority individuals acquire imposter syndrome, which we will talk about for this character as well. And others develop sentiments of animosity, which could also be added on top of the imposter syndrome. So, as a result of just being underestimated and dealing with the stereotype threats, which are the vulnerabilities, pressures, or concerns that a marginalized person has when being judged by unfavorable stereotypes about that group, it can be exhausting. It's stressful. It's tired. We're done, right? So it demotivates you from previously appreciated employment. So like maybe before you liked what you did, but now it's like you're kind of sick of it. You're kind of done, kind of over it. It tires you out quickly, and it kind of just confirms the prejudice that, you know, it's like, oh, well, I guess you just weren't made for this because of how you are, which is just overall very gross. Because it's like, no, I'm just stressed to no end. I'm tired. Of course, resentment is then built along with imposter syndrome, and they coexist, and that results in perfectionist characteristics. So this is what we're also going to dive into for this character. The persistent need to just do things to disprove preconceptions so that one does not feel like a fraud. So basically being like, wait, I can prove myself. Like, actually, if I do this, then you will see me as like great. It's like, I want to be seen. And I think, again, dialing back a little bit to what we previously talked about within, I believe, the attachment style podcast, right? Where we talked about like fearful avoidance with high anxious tendency. This might be partially where that high anxious tendency comes from, where it's like, you know, I gotta have to prove something to you, be like, look at me, you know, I'm doing these things, I'm good enough, I'm great. And it's just like, damn, especially again when it comes to like a narcissistic family model, it doesn't matter like how much you do, it's like, it's not gonna be enough. And we did talk about that. It's like, it's not gonna be enough. It's exhausting. You can't keep up with it forever. It's like you're gonna tire yourself out. And all of these are results of like overall just workplace sexism. But because the crime market has like even wider gender gaps, these feelings are exacerbated, like to the 10th degree. Like, it's just so much worse. So on the other hand, we already mentioned this character may also run into a lot of other problems, and we did reference, and again, trigger warning to no end for what is essentially going to be part 3, I believe, because we're going to dive into more so of a darker topic. We are going to be discussing sexual violence. If this is not the thing for you, understandably so, please click out. This is definitely a topic in which I want to explore in a safe way. Hopefully, if you're still here, I do it in a way that does not, you know, trigger certain things, but still, content warning, trigger warning ahead for conversations and discussions of sexual violence, because that will be the next thing that we have a hypothesis about. Now, this is the one where it's like, I don't have as much evidence for, but considering the industry that we are in, it is a concept that we do kind of have to explore. We kind of do have to talk about it. So, hopefully, we're going to take a very, very slow break this time. So, take as long as you need before we dive into this next thing, because it's going to be a lot. Hello everybody, and welcome back from our break. Alright, let's get into it, because again, this is a darker topic. I will try my best to kind of diffuse the darkness a little bit, but obviously the mood will slightly change. We had our moment of fun, but we need to get serious. So, this chapter is titled Being Violated at Work. let's explore this concept respectfully. Now, when we think victim, obviously we are still deconstructing the ideas of a quote-unquote perfect victim. I'm glad, especially within my generation, we don't believe that bullshit as much, where it's like, if people aren't perfect, what makes you think that a victim is going to be inherently perfect, right? We explore these concepts very vastly. But that being said, when we think of Illumi, certain people, not everybody, when it comes to the conversations around this character, let's be honest, victimhood is not in the room with us for some reason. Yes, this character tends to be cold and self-sufficient. So, like, for some people, it'd be like, what? You know, it's confusing. But, like, here's the thing. First and foremost, victims of any kind of abuse, particularly in this context of discussing sexual abuse, are unlikely to fit into, like, the ideal victim narrative of, like, perpetual powerlessness, like, all the time, right? Where it's like, oh, woe is me type of thing. Like, don't get me wrong, there are some victims that are like that, and their experiences are also valid. But that's not everybody, though. It's not. So, the fact that, you know, this character may have had their trust perhaps betrayed when they were younger may be another factor contributing to the extreme mistrust of people that we have discussed, especially within the attachment style podcast episode. So, again, discussions of how maybe fearful avoidance tends to develop. Of course, abusive households being one of them. But apparently, you know, having this particular kind of abuse in the context of, like, sexual abuse, there have been, like, cases where it could also develop due to that. So, youth is a precious time in development, with that being said. And constantly battering it with, like, violations after violations. I mean, it could truly just break a child's soul. And eventually just create a very bitter adult, and understandably bitter. Because it's like, damn, if this is how, you know, people are, then, I mean, I guess, what do I have to gain in trusting people? So, after all, working in the criminal underworld, let's be honest, it can lead to some pretty unsavory encounters with some pretty unsavory characters of people. People who are more than willing to exploit others and entrap someone with their naivete, right? So, in a sense, right, of course this character has their sense of cruelty, but that was built up over time. Like, we can't deny that, right? Where the sense of cruelty, it's like, you kind of have to. Because if you don't, it's like, if you have this sense of, like, optimism and joy, it's like, that was probably, you know, like, with this character, it's like, that was my mistake. Yeah? Never again. There's so many ways in which I believe, you know, like, for this character, if there would be a reflection, or maybe not. It's not even a full reflection. It's like, I just completely disassociated. We didn't talk in great detail about disassociation, but we did somewhat talk about it, specifically with the current mental state podcast episode. And I know with specific victims, that tends to be the case, where it's like, there's just certain things where it's like, disassociate. I don't remember, I don't want to remember. And understandably so. Your brain does whatever it does to protect itself. So, to some people, it's like, well, that seems unlikely, but let's sit and think about it. You never know what makes people who they really are, right? And again, some of Illumi's work goes beyond just mere physical harm. And I did not discuss this, but there's also such a thing as, like, honeypot missions. And surface level, it seems like a fun concept to explore, but I'm the type of bitch that unfortunately, loves to think a little too much. And again, it's like, but did we think about the implications? And it's like, here she go. I'm sorry. Did we think about the implications and the high potential of ending up in a situation of sexual abuse? No, just me. Well, we're going to explore that right about now. So, we must establish what type of trauma this is in order to comprehend it fully. Again, a concept that I personally would love to explore in a curious kind of way. Sad, curious kind of way. First things first, let us establish what sexual abuse is and what kinds exist, because unfortunately, this topic is already breaking my spirit. There's multiple kinds. So, sexual abuse is the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature, whether it be by force or unequal or corrosive conditions. It includes sexual slavery, pornography, child abuse, and sexual assault. The different types include, but are not limited to, sexual exploitation, which is the actual act or attempted abuse of somebody's position of vulnerability, such as a person depending on you for survival, food, school, transportation, etc., or differential power or trust to obtain sexual favors, including but not only by offering money or other social, economic, or political advantages. It includes prostitution and trafficking being the main two. I have no doubt that, again, these types of industries do tend to mix in. So I don't think it was full on, but at least being associated with that kind of line of work, or like having other people around you that are within those lines of work, murky waters. So, sexual assault, which is probably the darkest one besides sexual exploitation. All of these, by the way, are very much on the dark end, but this one is probably the one where it's like, yeah, it's up there. So sexual assault is unwanted sexual activity, with perpetrators often using force, making threats, or taking advantage of a victim's inability to give consent. And yeah, I'm allowed to say it on here, at least I think. This is normally where rape would be categorized. That's where it's at. It don't feel right. This is real dark territory. Sexual harassment is the inappropriate conduct of a sexual nature that is unwelcome, especially within the workplace. So, anything more so like catcalling, sexual jokes, things of that nature, sexual harassment. So this sexual harassment is probably, it's still gross, still disgusting, but it is, please do not kill me, quote unquote, and I do mean this in the highest of quotations, the lighter end of everything discussed. You don't want any of these things happening to you, but in the unfortunate circumstance where something happens to you, the off remark of a sexual nature, you could brush it off. You know, it's gross as shit. It's like, that kind of thing. You could brush it off. Sexual assault and sexual exploitation, those are normally the ones in which, damn, cannot brush that off. At all. All of these, by the way, are gross. Just want to make that clarified. So, Illumi's potential experience with sexual trauma, let's dive into it immediately. And quickly, because I'm already not feeling okay. So for Illumi, family is everything, right? Loving someone requires sacrificing oneself, but some sacrifices are probably too great to bear. Even though sexual abuse is not mentioned deeply within Hunter x Hunter, human trafficking is mentioned. So the possibility that sexual exploitation at least occurs within the series. So it's not beyond us to say that, sexual exploitation and abuse is completely possible. Of course, it's just not as deeply referenced. So, with that being said, Illumi learned probably at a young age, and this is the part where it's like, it's going to disgust me, so please be patient with me. I'm going to take my time with this one. So Illumi learned at a young age, perhaps, to use God-given gifts, beauty, if you will. It's like beauty as an asset is something that is meant to be used as a tool for advancement of the family, right? I thought about this back in the day when I was doing a comparison again, back in my old Twitter days. And I compared Illumi's character specifically to, and again, I'm not pro-Disney, but this is a good example of specifically with Isabella. There are plenty of non-Disney examples that I would have to find and say later on, but with Isabella's character, right, from Encanto, specifically, it was also pretty much a good example of using beauty kind of as something to advance you further, right? So, it's like you gotta sacrifice oneself. In her case, it was with marriage. Probably would have been the same for this character, of course. And we did talk about the potential of that earlier, but and if that means like objectifying one's body, so let's take it a step darker, right? It's like, yes, darker. It's like objectifying one's body, maybe doing a couple of salacious shit that's like, it drains you. Fucking hell, man. Selling your body, put it simply, for the benefit of maybe like gaining information or financial gain from clients, then so be it. Again, it's like, yay, fun, but not really. Because, and here's the thing that I probably want to sit down and think about, specifically for this character. It's like, I'm gonna be real, especially when discussing like this character's sexuality and things it's are. I don't think of this character as like, I don't like the concepts of virginity, but technically I'm using it anyways, right? I don't think that's the case, but then again, I think with this certain dark area, I would argue pretty black area, most of the interactions probably with like men in the past were coercive. So like, maybe this is with his fiance is probably one of the first interactions where it's like full on consensual, where it's like, yes, this is definitely my idea. I am in complete control of the situation. There is not a chance of someone taking advantage of me in that way, First time of like true established trust versus like probably with the other encounters where it's like not so much. Where it's like it's there. I guess you could say it counts, but it's like it was coercive. So it definitely was not enjoyable. Ugh. Damn. I promised myself I wouldn't cry, but we're there. We're almost there. Unfortunately, this can lead to the development or worsening of maybe like PTSD and other mental health issues, such as body dysmorphia and depression. Yeah. So one might wonder if Illumi's family made any attempts to console him after such a traumatic experience. The answer is probably no. Obviously not, sadly. And the reasons have varying factors. One of the main ones are cultural. Let's talk about that now. Unhealthy coping. So, when going through sexual abuse, it is one of the most painful experiences that someone could have. It's very disorienting to have one's autonomy taken completely from them. And recovering, it's a journey in and of itself. Those who have not discovered healthy coping mechanisms and or therapy are more likely to develop maladaptive coping mechanisms. So, some people repress what happened to them and just push it away. Others may develop some form of dissociation and depersonalization to avoid feeling the pain. Now, for this specific character, I believe it's a blend of the two, but more so with number 2 rather than number 1. So in other words, more so of a dissociation and depersonalization. Kind of like body present, but like mentally just not there. Kind of thing. So a victim might blame themselves. We see that a lot. Because there's nothing worse than realizing that there's no true cause except for another person's corruption and wanting to control them. Yeah, and feeling used leaves one feeling hollowed and numb. It's very... I have never experienced this myself, but I know people that have experienced it. I know one too many. It's painful watching them suffer. So, culture is also the reason for unhealthy coping mechanisms for Illumi, as within Asian or other people of color communities. See, sexual assault is considered a personal problem in a lot of these cultures. As somebody who grew up relatively within both African American and African, shout out to the Black diaspora, I would say that the way we talk about sexual assault is also kind of weird. Yeah, it is. If it happens to somebody, they must have done something to provoke it. So a lot of victim blaming. I mean, with generally, especially in the West, it's everybody, but there's a unique way of specifically people of color doing it that's just, it's out there. I wouldn't say it's the greatest thing, you know. So it's probably a common thing, and that this has probably been said to the character hypothetically, right? You know, these things just happen to pretty, and I'm going to use the term girl, but, you know, obviously changed over time. Like you, it's like, you're a pretty person. It's not a big deal. These things happen. Also, on top of that, specifically with Asian cultures, they tend to adhere to a patriarchal hierarchy. Most cultures do, but specifically we're exploring Asian cultures, which endorses a dominant role for men and a submissive role inherently for women. So, we kind of discussed that a little earlier, but this is more so in the cultural context. So, women in this culture specifically are expected to be kind of just sexually restrained and modest. Purity culture, ain't it fun? So, even in the potential exploitation is for the benefit of the family business, it's still considered pretty shameful. Not to be talked about. It's just thing that happens. Don't ever talk about it. It's gross. So this can also prevent maybe Illumi from maybe getting help. Yeah? Along with Illumi's teachings about not trusting other people, because people are inherently twisted and they will betray you in the end. So like, what's the point of asking for help if they're probably not going to do that? So, it's so great. Oh, so great. Wow. So, yeah, that's it. This is a special portion, so because of it, I'm going to just cut it off and go immediately to the next one. The next one is going to be fun again. Depression moment over. We can... let's have a couple of meditation moments, because that was a lot. Breathe in. Breathe out. Right? This is probably one of those moments where it's like, wow, I might need therapy. That was a lot. And was. But breathe out. We went through it. So let's all take kind of a very somewhat long break, right? So I'm going to put a break after this, and we're going to go straight to the fun part, which is the reason for, within my essay, I've done like a couple of pronoun changes. So we're going to explore like just Illumi's gender. Now we're at the part where it's like, here we go. Like the most fun part of them all. Dark moment over. So I will see y'all in a little bit. Okay, everybody, this is the fun part. We had our moment, but we're back now. So, let's talk. This is the part that we've been waiting for. So, let's talk Illumi's very intense relationship with his very own gender. So, throughout the series, and this is the fun part, especially with like shape-shifting characters and exploring kind of like the concept of gender fluidity, we're gonna have a good time. So, throughout the series, despite his current gender identity, Illumi's gender presentation might be perceived best as androgynous. However, there appears to be more of this enigma, you know? So, with Illumi's character, it could be seen as transmasculine, technically, right? As well. So, some examples of this would be the use of gendered language specifically for this character. So, when referred to in the manga, ore is generally used to describe most of the males in the series. However, within Illumi's family, watashi tends to be used way more often, which is a gender-neutral term that most of the females within the series typically uses. Now, just a slight thing that I've observed, especially when reading the Japanese version. This is not only the examples within the series. We're going to talk way more. This is just fun things that I've noticed. So in this section, we will be observing Illumi's gender identity as well as gender presentation and other elements that apply to their gender. Dive in, strap in. This is going to be fun. Alright, the gender observation of Illumi Zoldyck. We're finally here. The moment we've been waiting for. So gender is a constantly shifting idea for this character. Quite literally. This character's a shapeshifter. See what I did there? I'm so funny. Okay, so because of their capabilities to shapeshift, commonly known as bodily alteration, this character can express their gender in a variety of ways. It's a beautiful part about it all, right? So this has a lot in common with, again, gender fluidity, which is when a person's gender frequently changes. When we look at this character, we clearly see a mix of both feminine and masculine features merging or leaning towards one of the gender presentations, depending on the situation or, honestly, just how this character feels. It's like, I'm feeling more of a feminine vibe today. This character would just go for that. I'm feeling more of a masculine vibe. This character would just go to that. There is no putting this character in a box. It's just the vibe. That's the beauty of it all. It's like, it honestly doesn't matter what you consider this character. And it's like, the beautiful part about it is you can do whatever the fuck you want. So a good example of this from another series would be like with the series of She-Ra. And a particular character is with Double Trouble, again from the Netflix's She-Ra and the Princess of Power, who was a chameleon-like character, is one technique, and it's used to depict non-binary characters within like superhero films, especially films and TV shows. Most of the characters who are more so on the non-binary and will typically have shape-shifting. That's not always the case, but a lot of the times it is. So that's just kind of another fun thing that I've noticed. Let's get cooking a little bit more. So, with that being said, Illumi's gender is classified as transmasculine, with his use of masculine pronouns and references to his identity. For example, most of Illumi's siblings refer to him as Aniki, which means older brother in Japanese. So, also consider his appearance in chapter 322. He appears to have short hair, wears a tracksuit and wears a gray shirt, as well as either jeans or track pants. Could never tell. I believe it was jeans. I could be heavily wrong. Either which way, pants. So this appearance is more so on the masculine end, particularly for a teen in, I said the early 2010s. It depends on which timeline you're using. I'm using the modern one. If you are using the one specifically for the 99 timeline, do that math as you will. I'm not doing that. So, at this particular time, there was presumably a stronger emphasis on a more so masculine gender presentation back when I was younger. So, what exactly is a transmasculine person? I'm glad you asked. This is what we're here to talk about. So, to define transmasculinity, transmasculine is best defined as an umbrella term that refers to people who were assigned female at birth, but identify with masculinity in some kind of way. The abbreviation, of course, is commonly known as transmasc, which is more so what people tend to see. There are a multitude of examples that fit under this umbrella, such as being a transgender man. You are someone who's a female at birth, non-binary person who identifies with masculinity. You are someone who is a female at birth, who is a demi-boy, which is somebody that partially identifies as a boy, man, or masculine in general. You are someone who is a female at birth, gender fluid, who identifies as masculine all, most, or some of the time. Now for this particular character, we are going to go with number 4. And of course, any other identities who identify with masculinity, who are of course still within somebody who's a female at birth, of course being the main qualifier. So it is important to note that transmasculine people, of course, don't always follow what's expected of their gender expectations of men or anything associated with masculinity within their culture, and they might not follow through the gender roles associated with masculinity. And we did talk about that a little bit for this particular character, but in general, yes, there are trans people whose dysphoria looks all kinds of ways. There are certain trans people who it's just like, they don't necessarily have the traditional sense of dysphoria at all. It's kind of just like, this is what I am. There is nothing really. It's like, this is just the vibe. Now, for this particular character, that's honestly up to audience interpretation, what you're more so willing to explore, specifically in your particular fictions or whatever medium that you use to explore. It's up to you. That's the fun part. Up to an audience interpretation for that one. But overall, that is the general consensus of transmasculinity. Now that we got that shit down, so when it comes to Illumi's gender expectations, they tend to lean more towards the feminine expectations that we discussed, with of course a touch of masculinity mixed in, which we already talked about a little bit earlier within this particular episode. So this is best described by Illumi's character archetypes and appearance as well. So in this section that we'll also talk about, we will be exploring Illumi's gender presentation even further with archetype and appearance. So, this character occasionally suffocating and overprotective nature towards basically anybody else that he's close to, keyword, is related to more so of what is typically associated as a feminine archetype of the caregiver. It is more so associated within that, however, there's a reason why it has more so the gender neutral term of caregiver. Anybody of any gender for characters can fit into this archetype, not just the ladies, but it is more so of a feminine archetype. It is tend to be associated with that. So, to be a caretaker, one must be an altruist, which is motivated to help others by typically compassion, kindness, and selflessness. They can be prone to martyrdom and enabling actions, and the inner caregiver assists in raising children, as we saw, as well as building frameworks to sustain life and health. However, the oppressing martyr, which is the shadow version, And I believe within my Twitter series, we talked about like where archetypes come from. By the way, it comes from a psychologist named Carl Jung. And he talks a lot about archetypes, ego, ID, aka identity, things of that nature. That's more so of his thing, right? You'll probably have to more so follow my Twitter series for that, because I did dive into it, but I'll possibly do one specifically for my Spotify audience. But just so you know, archetypes, appearance, concept, especially for archetypes created by Carl Jung, who I believe he passed away, was a student of Sigmund Freud, but obviously he saw Sigmund Freud's concept and was like, this is crazy, but you were spitting sometimes, so I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna make it better. That's what happened. Hey. The crackheads got some good ideas. Let me steal some of it. I will not steal, but let me take some of them and make it better. Make it not sound too crackerlicious. So, the oppressing martyr is the shadow version of the archetype who manipulates people by making them feel bad. That's surface level. Obviously, with this manipulation, it goes deeper than that. Is the dark counterpart, which Illumi, of course, more so veers towards. So, with that being said, his treatment of Killua, which is the youngster to whom he gives the most direction to, is the best illustration of this particular archetype. So from the pen, to keep Killua out of harm's way, with the commands, don't fight any opponents that are stronger than you. To utilize his hypnotic spell to prevent a battle between them during the Hunter exam. We saw this already. So these methods represent a tainted version of security. So again, not typically what you would see for this archetype unless you're in the shadow version. To protect the future Zoldyck family leader, that was the primary goal for Illumi, which corresponds to, again, more so along the feminine expectation of nurturing others. However, because this is a dark subversion, it appears more so codependent and manipulative. So another minor example would be assisting with his fiance's plans when asked. Just a small example of that. So, another aspect of his gender representation is, of course, color schemes that his characters relate to. Color schemes, especially when it comes to clothing. This is the fun part. So, when Illumi appears to be on screen, he typically wears green, which, related favorably, might signify things such as optimism, optimism, development, and fertility. But when connected in a negative way, it's most often associated with the concepts of death and decay. Of course, we see this more so with the negative and maybe kind of the positive. It depends on what type of green. Obviously, with dark green, that we see more so in the beginning of the series, is definitely more so of a sense of death and decay. But I'm not sure if, like, the colored manga version, if I've noticed a slight color change. But I do notice with the clothing, the green is way lighter than in the beginning of the series. So it's like, now it probably leans more so towards the lighter end, which is optimism, development, and fertility. Yes, that can pertain to stereotypically childbirth, but that doesn't always mean like childbirth. That also can mean like fruitfulness and just life in general. That too. So we'll talk about that as well, but it's like, that's for way later. So the other color he tends to be associated with, of course, is purple, which is associated with wisdom, transformation, and spirituality. Now, combining the aspects of green with decay and death, as well as wisdom from the purple color schemes at times, may provide us with a clue into Illumi's characterization. Also, another thing for the color purple, it's also typically associated with wealth and power. And of course, kind of with this character being like, oh, I need to have the feeling of control, right? I need some sense of like power and control, because for the most part, it's like I never had that. I want to know what that feels. I want to have a taste of that. So if you want to also associate it in that way, that could be another way of exploring it. So Illumi's appearance is normally closely related to that. Now we're going to talk about like facial and everything else with the body. Now that we got the clothes out of the way, let's talk face. Illumi's appearance is normally closely related to that of a Japanese woman. To be honest, yeah. Which aligns with the beauty standards of Japan, which is large eyes, small nose, pouty lips, fair skin. It completes the picture. Especially with the manga version, probably more so aligns. I don't hate the anime version, but it's like the manga version's superior. Just saying. It more so fits the description that I just said. This appearance gives off the illusion of innocence. There we go. So this plays into the expression of Japanese women typically needing to appear demure, cute, or in their case, they would typically say like kawaii, to appear harmless to men. Now, appearance alone isn't the only thing that fits with this standard. Also, a thing that you could probably add to this description would be Illumi's voice, which is soft and joyous, which at times can be, admittedly, somewhat childish. Not gonna lie, yeah, it can sound like that. It's more so within the lines, if we're gonna talk like vocal science completely, it is breathy, it's somewhat lower. I won't say like too low. It's more so the lines if you could get away with it in the sense of like tenor, alto kind of tone. So it's like lower, but not like so low to the point it's like baritone and bass. It's like, it's still in the middle kind of thing, right? It's like you could even get away with mezzo soprano if you try hard enough. If you're not a singer or not been involved in vocal science, you have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about. In other words, medium low to medium high type of voice, basically. So, with that being said, this voice can also be used as a weapon to lure victims into a moment of comfort, because it's like, ooh, it's so soothing, it's so soft. Again, we talked about this before, even with the perception of like, you know, gender being like, oh my god, you know, like, it's so soft, it's like so alluring, it's like, no way would you stab me. Stab. That's a surprise. You didn't expect it. It's crazy. The voice can very much so be a weapon. Again, alluring victims in like honey. It's very much so like honey. You catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? So, moment of comfort. Final blow. Jab. Hey. Similar to the sweet liquid of a pitcher plant. Which, for those of you that don't know what a pitcher plant is, I'll possibly show a picture on my Twitter later. But it's the type of plant in which traps their prey in a honey-like substance to be then eaten later. I know, right? Predator type of plant. It's pretty cool. It's crazy. But that's essentially the comparison, the metaphor. I want to get into your head, get into your mental, the imagery. Place in your head. Alright. So, Illumi is also described at times as inexpressive, which we did discuss also with the current mental state, and we talked about like kind of a flat face. That's not the right word, but I'm gonna say flat face, like the nickname for it, like flat face or flat tone, you know, both in like vocal expression. So with like the vocal inflection, it's a little different. More so along the face, particularly when we were exploring like autism within this character, but another way of exploring it as well as from the mental health state. It's also with the expression state. So with Illumi being described as inexpressive at times, not all the time, but like sometimes, right? So it's like when specifically he is in that mode of facial expression. In Japanese culture, it's actually not that weird. It's not. It is being expressive, inexpressive. It's actually another feminine expectation to follow. I did not know that until I did the research. It was a weird thing for me to learn, right? Because within the US, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, oh, you have to like smile and things like that. Versus like within Japan, it's like, you don't have to do all that. That's a lot. I think like in a lot of other cultures, like they would probably say it's like, you know, with the US, it's like y'all are a little too friendly. Don't smile as much. There's that. So, and we definitely see this another way of like inexpressive, aka just being kind of more stale in the face. A common figure that could also be used as a example would be like Hello Kitty, right? It's like ultimate cuteness apparently with Hello Kitty is basically her just kind of having a blank face. That's why she doesn't have a mouth, because it was seen as cute. I know, right? That's why. It's like, whoa. Cultural differences. So fun to learn. So crazy. The more you know. And even with this character, specifically, he's kind of drawn, I would argue, in kind of the same way as like Hello Kitty. There are times where it's just like little to no mouth. Just everything else. Face. Blank. And it's like, wow, that's basically the same thing. On top of that, speaking of Hello Kitty, this character, and I think we're going to dive into that more, is modeled specifically after Pacific cat-like style. So there's that as well. Fun stuff with your girl. We're learning together. It's like, so yeah, with all that being said, even though Illumi seems to have this appearance, he's still deadly, and thus mixes this appearance with femme fatale traits at times. So again, talking about that, one example is the juxtaposition of thin hands and retractable claws. True wolf in sheep's clothing, right? That image of delicacy. Oh look, deadliness. A perfect combination, in my opinion. Perfect combo. What could go wrong? So there's also a matter of his disguise to consider, and this is probably the part where like people definitely want me to talk about. When Illumi assumes the form of Jitaraku, or Jita for short, he resembles like specifically Pinhead from the film Hellraiser, or at least that's what I commonly associated it with. Except he's way more bulkier and more manly, quote unquote, right? So the icing on the cake is a very warped masculine voice whenever he's within this specific disguise. So with this appearance, first seen within the Hunter x Hunter chapter 6, he is given an unusual expression that makes him more expressive than he generally is. So there's that. He also appears, speaking of appearances, now going back to him having a normal face, he appears casually in flame pants and a bandage style shirt in the election arc with Illumi. So we see that definitely the costume change. It's like the famous flame pants, bandage style shirt, which I definitely see more so, especially nowadays. It's like the 2000s are bad. It's like having that kind of punk style. It is within the punk category. So there's that, which can be associated with, again, alternative fashion and fits neither into the conventions of feminine or masculine clothing expectations. Kind of goes beyond that. We love that about punk clothes. We do. So, in the Hunter exam, though he appears to wear princess puffs as sleeves, a look that is associated with hyper-femininity. So, later in the Secession War arc, he appears in a jacket that is adorned with needles and boots, and also adorned with needles at the ankles. So, the needles look like golden stumps. So, given the appearance of androgyny once more. This also pertains to the body type that Illumi tends to have when appearing as a silhouette or just casually, which is pear shape, which is typically a feminine body type that gives off the appearance of small waist, slim arms, and shoulders, along with wide hips and a small bust. next to the hourglass, this particular body type is the most idealistic, and that's just a little fun fact, as an additional. So along with this body strength within muscles that could kill people, it is compressed within a very delicate looking appearance. Now, of course, you could see like some of the muscles being defined within the drawings in Pacific, but obviously compared like to that of, say, like his fiance, still more quote unquote of a delicate appearance. Now, action is different from appearance. I'm speaking specifically how it looks. That's it. The muscles are there, don't get me wrong, but arguably still a pretty thin hand. So, and of course, even though I would say it's not completely accurate, when it's like, I think it was for the Hunterpedia in Pacific, right? In Pacific, it's like, what height and what like body weight. For this specific character, I believe he's technically considered underweight. Especially for the height considered, whether you explore either within the feminine or masculine. I think going more towards the feminine end, I'm not sure if it would still count as underweight. I believe probably still so. I forgot how much, but it's like it was kind of low. So again, fairly thin, all that other stuff. Let's get into the other characteristics. So these characteristics come together to form another aspect of Illumi's identity. Although this character occasionally perceives their gender presentation as inherently a weapon, because of course, kind of how, this character has been molded, most of the time it comes across as something more amorphous and casual. So it doesn't take much thought because it constantly just blends, mixes, and matches, almost like playing dress up with a doll, which is ironic considering that's kind of the main description for this character. So though gender demands can weigh on the character at times, they usually manage with their own solutions, and the Zoldyck household appears to again mainly be alright with gender presentations that depart from social conventions, though certain gender expectations tend to persist. So, gender overall is a very important aspect to an individual's identity and a slice of one's own pie. And that is basically concludes the gender exploration of Illumi. Let me know if there's something else that you want me to talk about in little itty tidbits of ways, or something else that you would probably like to maybe clarify, maybe you feel more curious about. Just open the discussion, to all kinds of things. Let's get the ball rolling to the conversation. Anyways, guys, thank you for listening. So glad that you were here. This is probably one of the longer episodes. But it's great. We talked about a lot of good concepts, and I promise for the next episode, which will be parentification, and then after that's done, and we will talk about potential like redemption, potential character developments, where do I think this character is heading, and that should probably be like the conclusion. And then we're gonna move on. We're probably gonna do a couple tea talks, but then after we're gonna move on to his fiance, so that's gonna be fun. Stay tuned for like definitely Hisoka's character analysis, because that one's gonna be fun. That one's gonna be an adventure. Ooh. Yeah, but anyways, good night or good morning, depending on what time you are listening to this, or good afternoon. You never know what time you're listening to this, and I will see you guys next time.